right? Come in, sit down, mind the mess. I've got the good chair for you and everything. I want to show you something, and I want to show it to you before anyone smooths it over. There is a particular kind of person you meet, maybe twice in a lifetime, if you are lucky, and only once if you are not. They tell you something on a Monday with absolute conviction, eye contact, hand on the shoulder, weight behind the words. And then on the Tuesday they tell you the exact opposite, with exactly the same conviction, exactly the same eye contact, and this is the part that quietly breaks your brain. They are not lying to you. Not in any way you'd recognize. They believe the first thing on Monday. They believe the second thing on Tuesday. And if you make the mistake of holding the two statements up side by side and asking gently which one is the real one, they look at you like you are the one who has developed a problem. Now, ordinarily that person is a colleague or a landlord or a relative you only see at Christmas, and the stakes are a shared kitchen or an unreturned drill. This week that person is the President of the United States. The stakes are a shooting war in the Persian Gulf that has now been running for very nearly 6 months. And the two statements were separated by about 24 hours. So let's go through it, because the sequence matters more than the punchline. On Monday the 17th, Jared Kushner, who is the special envoy for peace and also, in a detail that has stopped being remarkable to anyone, the president's son-in-law sat down with Fox News. And Kushner was asked where the negotiations with Iran actually stand. And he said something quite specific. He said the conversations between the U.S. government and different parts of the Iranian government were, and I'm quoting him, probably more robust than it's maybe ever been. He described them as positive and active. He added in the same breath that Iran was not showing much interest in a deal that makes sense for the United States, and that the president was going to be patient, that he did not want to rush. Now, hold those two halves together for a second, because they are already in mild tension with each other. The talks are the most robust they have ever been, and also the other side isn't interested. Fine. Diplomacy is like that. That is Monday. Tuesday morning, the 18th, the President of the United States posts on Truth Social, and the post says there are, quote, no talks or conversations going on or scheduled with Iran, not stalled, not paused, not delicate, none. Never mind more robust than they have ever been, there is nothing there at all. And the same post adds that the naval blockade remains in full force, that the Strait of Hormuz is open and operating, and that all the water mines have been removed or detonated. And a few hours before that, on the same morning, the same account posted a map, a picture of a nautical chart with the Strait of Hormuz circled on it, captioned as a new U.S. territory. No further explanation, no context. A map of somebody else's water with a line drawn round it. So within a single news cycle, you have the chief negotiator saying the channel is the healthiest it has ever been, the president saying the channel does not exist, and the president also announcing cartographically that he has annexed a body of water that sits in Iranian and Omani territorial waters, and through which, in peacetime, about a fifth of the world's oil moves. And I want to be scrupulous here, because it would be easy to be lazy about this. The president is not only contradicting Kushner, he is also contradicting himself, because he had previously acknowledged that there were back-channel contacts with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And 2 weeks or so before that, he had publicly accused the Iranian leadership of being duplicitous, his word, precisely because they had denied that talks were happening. So, the position, as best as anyone can reconstruct it, is this. Iran was lying when it said there were no talks, and now there are no talks. Both of those cannot be true. And I would love to tell you which one is, but that would require me to know something the president's own negotiator apparently doesn't. And of course, the White House has an answer for all of this. And the answer is that the president is a deal maker, that unpredictability is leverage, that keeping Tehran off balance is the entire point, and that people who need everything spelled out neatly have never negotiated anything harder than a car lease. I want to take that seriously for a moment, because it isn't a stupid argument. Strategic ambiguity is a real thing. It has a literature. It has worked. There are moments in the history of this exact region where a leader saying one thing publicly and another thing privately bought space, that clarity would have closed off. So the question is not whether ambiguity can work. The question is whether this is ambiguity, or whether it's just noise wearing ambiguity's jacket. And the way you tell the difference is simple. Deliberate ambiguity is when your adversary can't tell what you'll do next. Noise is when your own negotiator can't tell what you'll do next. When Kushner has to find out the state of his own file from a social media post. And I would love to know what that Tuesday morning was like in his house. You are no longer running a strategy. You are running a mood. And here is why that is not a gossip item, and why I'd ask you to stay with me, even though the temptation with a story like this is to laugh, screenshot it, and move on. It is not a gossip item because the counterparty is watching. Tehran is not reading these two statements and thinking, clever, we cannot predict them. Tehran is reading these two statements and drawing a much more damaging conclusion, which is that whatever the Americans agree to on a Monday has no guaranteed shelf life into Tuesday. And once your opponent believes that, the entire architecture of negotiation stops functioning because there is nothing to negotiate for. You cannot trade concessions for guarantees if the guarantee expires overnight, which, if you want the short version of why 6 months of this has produced no agreement, is most of it. And you can see the effect in Tehran's own posture, because they are no longer negotiating like people who expect a deal. The Iranian parliamentary speaker set out the terms publicly this week. The strait stays shut until the United States lifts the blockade, unfreezes Iranian assets, drops the oil sanctions, and ends military operations on all fronts. That is not a bargaining position. That is a list. You publish a list like that when you have concluded there is no private channel worth protecting. The Iranian deputy foreign minister, meanwhile, responded to the annexation map by calling it a delusion and saying it would be corrected, which, whatever else you think about the Iranian government, is a fairly economical piece of writing. And Iran had already said, earlier, that the strait could not be seized by tweet, by aircraft carrier, by executive order, or by campaign speech. 4 methods. They ruled out 4 methods. I would gently note that they only had to rule out 4 because 4 had been attempted. So how did the United States get here? Because this did not start in August. It started on the 28th of February, when the U.S. and Israel launched joint strikes on Iranian military, government, and nuclear infrastructure. Operation Epic Fury, and the stated objective, repeated many times since, was that Iran would never have a nuclear weapon. That is the justification. It has been consistent, and it is not a trivial one. Nuclear proliferation in that region is a genuine, serious, hard problem, and anybody who waves it away is not being honest with you. But it is worth remembering what the man who ordered those strikes had spent the previous 15 years saying. In 2011, in a video, he predicted that a sitting American president would start a war with Iran because he had no ability to negotiate. On the campaign trail, repeatedly, he told his own supporters that he was not going to start a war, he was going to stop wars. That was not a throwaway line. That was, for a very large part of his coalition, the entire deal. And so, within 72 hours of the first strikes, that coalition began arguing with itself in public. And it has not really stopped since. The complaint from inside the movement was not squeamishness about force. It was that the explanations kept moving, that the regime's leadership had been killed, but this was not a regime change war. That the nuclear program had been obliterated, but the nuclear program was the reason it had to continue. And when the Secretary of State suggested that Israeli planning had shaped the American decision, that did not calm anybody down. It is an awkward thing for an America First movement to discover that the first item on the agenda was somebody else's. And the contradictions did not stop at the doctrinal level, they went right down into the daily commentary, which is where they became almost surreal. In March, there was a single afternoon in which the president told CBS the war was very complete, pretty much, while the Defense Department's own rapid response account posted that they had only just begun to fight, and the defense secretary had told 60 Minutes days earlier that this was only the beginning. In the same interview, the president said Iran had nothing left, in a military sense, no navy, no air force, no communications, and then later, that same day described most of Iran's naval power as sunk, which is a different claim entirely, because most is not all, and all was the number he had used 90 minutes previously. In May, he was asked about having said the U.S. might be better off with no deal at all, and he said flatly that he didn't say that, 24 hours after saying it on video at a public event in Palm Beach. In July, he contradicted himself 4 times in one Fox News interview. And this week, his own advisors are being contradicted on at least 3 separate aspects of the war simultaneously. So, this is not an aberration. This is the operating system. And now, the bill. Because this is a channel about consequences, and the consequences of this war are not abstract for Americans. They are, at this point, the single most measurable thing in American life. On the 27th of February, the day before the strikes, the AAA national average for a gallon of regular gasoline was just under $3. 39 states were below $3. Within 1 month, it was above $4, a jump of roughly $1 a gallon in 30 days, which is a sharper monthly rise than Katrina and sharper than the invasion of Ukraine. It peaked around $4.50 in June. As I record this, it is sitting just above $4, with California above $5.50. And the president's answer to that, delivered at a rally in New York on Friday, was that paying a tiny little bit more for your gasoline was worth it to stop a very evil country getting a nuclear weapon. And, look, as a moral proposition, that is at least an argument. It is a real argument. Reasonable people hold it, but notice what it is not. It is not the argument he ran on. He ran on the cost of living. He ran on it relentlessly. And $1 a gallon is not a tiny little bit more when you are driving 40 minutes each way to a job that has not given you a raise since the last time somebody explained to you that inflation was transitory. And gasoline is only the part you can see on a sign from the road. Energy prices were up 14.7% year-on-year last month. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas modeled this in the spring and found that even on a cautiously optimistic scenario, where the strait is closed for a single quarter and then exports gradually resume, the oil shock alone adds about 0.6 of a percentage point to U.S. headline inflation this year and 0.2 to core. We are now well past a single quarter. Headline inflation hit 3.3% in March, the highest in nearly 2 years. And the reason economists keep flagging the core number rather than the headline is that headline inflation is the part that goes away when oil goes away, and core is the part that has already crawled into the price of everything else and made itself comfortable. Then there is the actual bill. And here the numbers genuinely diverge, and I am going to give you the range rather than pick the one that sounds best, because the range is the story. The Pentagon's own acting chief financial officer told the House Appropriations Committee in early May that the conflict was approaching $29 billion. CSIS, working bottom-up from munitions expenditure, put the true figure somewhere in the 30s to low 40s of billions. Moody's Analytics, counting the costs absorbed by taxpayers and by consumers, put it at around $132 billion. And Linda Bilmes at Harvard, who has spent a career doing exactly this for Iraq and Afghanistan, and is generally the person who turns out to have been right about a decade later, argues the real long-run number is nearer $200 billion for a reason that is almost too neat. The Pentagon is costing munitions at what they cost to make, not at what they cost to replace. A Tomahawk that cost between $1 and $2 million to build now costs $3 to $6 million to replace on signed contracts. Replacement cost, she reckons, runs 2 to 3 times the inventory cost being used, which means the official figure is not so much wrong as measuring a different thing. And there is a strategic version of the same problem that has very little to do with money. The United States has burned through a substantial chunk of its advanced missile defense interceptor inventory. At one point in May, officials said more than 200 THAAD interceptors had been fired defending Israel, roughly half the total American stockpile, at something like $12 million each, against Iranian munitions that cost a small fraction of that. That is the asymmetry that ends empires, historically, not defeat, arithmetic. Lockheed Martin has been handed $35 billion to start rebuilding those stockpiles. The White House asked Congress for an $87 billion supplemental to backfill the rest, and Congress, including a meaningful number of Republicans, has been reluctant to write the check, because voting money for a popular war is easy, and voting money for an unpopular one is how you lose a primary. And there was reportedly a row between the president and the defense secretary last month, in which the president demanded to know why he felt he had been misled about the munition shortages, which is, of course, a very reasonable question. It is just an unusual one to be asking in month 5. And the reason those interceptors matter beyond the accounting is that they are not being replaced at the rate they are being spent. And every one of them that ends up over the Persian Gulf is one that is not available in the Western Pacific. CSIS said this out loud in the spring. The expenditure does not empty any single inventory to zero, but it creates real risk in other theaters. So, if you were a planner in a capital that has spent the last decade quietly worrying about a very different ocean, this war has been extremely informative. And then there is the part that does not appear in any budget line. As of this week, the verified official American death toll for Operation Epic Fury stands at 18. 3 of those were killed in July at Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, 1 the following day in Iraq, during a controlled detonation of a downed Iranian drone. The Pentagon's official wounded count passed 680 at the start of this month. But in July, the Department of Defense quietly changed how it counts, splitting casualties after the 7th of July into a new and unlabeled Overseas Operations category. And if you add the 2 pages together, you get a little over 700. And if you include known casualties that the system omits entirely, the total goes past 900. A U.S. official told The Intercept the new system was, quote, designed to obscure the count. Now, I cannot verify that characterization, and neither can you, and the Pentagon has declined to explain the change. But I would observe that there is no version of a reporting reform that accidentally makes a number harder to find. And there is the USS Abraham Lincoln, which left San Diego last November and has now been at sea for more than 260 days. Normal deployment is about 6 months. Military Times and Stars and Stripes have reported multiple sailors going overboard. Food rationing, plumbing failures, shortages of things like soap and toothpaste, and families going public about the mental health of the crew. The defense secretary said the reporting had been completely misrepresented. The head of Central Command visited the ship and described the experience as awe-inspiring. The president called it fake news and said he had spoken to an admiral, unnamed, who assured him the ship was beautifully maintained. A replacement carrier group is now on its way, and the Navy says the swap was always planned. And I want to be careful here, because it is entirely possible that the ship is fine and the reporting is overheated. That happens. But when a government's response to 3 separate outlets and a group of military families is to produce an anonymous admiral, the confidence problem is no longer really about the ship. Meanwhile, Congress has tried to stop this 10 times. 10. In March, a War Powers resolution died in the Senate. On the 3rd of June, the House passed one, 215 to 208, with 4 Republicans crossing. On the 23rd of June, the Senate passed one, 50 to 48, with Cassidy, Collins, Paul, and Murkowski crossing, and Fetterman voting the other way. In July, the House did it again, 214 to 208, and the Senate killed a parallel measure 47 to 49. None of it is binding. The concurrent resolutions never reach the president's desk, and the one that could have would have been vetoed. Congresswoman Jayapal, who led the House effort, said the war has had, in her words, no clear mission, no strategy, no end goal. Senator Kennedy, arguing the other way, said that forcing a withdrawal mid-conflict would be a huge blow to American credibility, and added that he did not think the war would decide the midterms, that the election would be about the cost of living. And I would just leave that sentence sitting there for a moment, because I am not sure Senator Kennedy has fully registered that, in this particular election, the war and the cost of living are the same subject. Which brings us to the politics, and the politics are now brutal. A Reuters/Ipsos poll that closed on Monday puts the president's approval at 33%, with 64% disapproving. That is the lowest of this presidency, and it ties the floor of the last one. An FT/Focal Data poll a week earlier had 35. The Economist tracker has him at the most negative net approval it has recorded for any president since it started in 2009. 80% of Americans think U.S. involvement in Iran will go on for an extended period, and that 80 includes 71% of Republicans. Only 16% expect it to be over in a few weeks. And for the first time in roughly a decade, more voters say they trust Democrats than Republicans on the economy. That last number is the one I would be reading in the White House, because everything else on that list is a war number, and war numbers historically recover. That one is not a war number. That is a realignment. Now, 3 things nobody knows. Nobody knows whether there is currently any functioning channel between Washington and Tehran, because the 2 men who would know have publicly given opposite answers within a day of each other, and neither has corrected the other. Nobody knows the real condition of the Iranian nuclear program, because the strikes were extensive, the inspections are not happening, and both governments have overwhelming incentives to misdescribe the result in opposite directions. And nobody, and this is the one I would actually pay money for, nobody knows whether the Strait of Hormuz is open. The president says it is open and operating, and that the mines have been cleared. Iran says it is closed and will stay closed. And the only thing that isn't a claim is the traffic data, which is why I want you to hold on to this one number. Over one recent 7-day stretch, shipping through the strait ran at about 17% of the pre-conflict average. 17, not 70. So, the strait is open in the specific sense that water is not a solid, and closed in every sense that a person chartering a tanker would recognize. And of course, the White House's answer to all of it is that prices will plummet back to pre-conflict levels once the military finishes degrading Iran's ability to attack shipping, which may well turn out to be true, and which has now been the forward guidance for approximately 6 months. So, where does this leave the United States? The stated goal was to stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, and it is genuinely possible that has been achieved, at least for some years, and if it has, that is not nothing, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But look at what has been spent to get an answer nobody can currently verify. Somewhere between $29 billion and $200 billion, depending on who is holding the calculator. 18 Americans dead and several hundred to 900 wounded, an account the government has made harder to perform. Half a missile defense stockpile that was supposed to be there for a different ocean. $1 a gallon every week out of the pocket of every household in the country. An aircraft carrier crew 9 months into a 6-month deployment. 10 congressional attempts to assert a constitutional power, all of them symbolic, which has now established a precedent that outlives this administration entirely. And a president who has annexed a strait on a map, threatened to bomb Oman, and told his own negotiator via social media that the negotiations he is conducting do not exist. There is an argument, and it deserves to be stated fairly because serious people make it, that the alternative was worse, that a nuclear-armed Iran would have cost more than any of this, and that history will grade the outcome and not the mess. Maybe. History does occasionally do that, but history also tends to notice when the cost of a policy is borne by people who were promised it would never be attempted. And here is the thing that will still be true in 10 years, when the pump price has normalized and the interceptors have been rebuilt and everyone has agreed to describe the whole episode as complicated. Every ally, the United States, has just spent 6 months learning something they cannot unlearn, that the American position on a given Monday is not necessarily the American position on the Tuesday, and that the person who tells you what it is may find out he was wrong from a phone notification. You cannot buy that back with a supplemental appropriation. You cannot bomb it back. There is no line item for it. It took decades to accumulate, and it took one news cycle to spend. And the achievement is genuinely remarkable when you sit with it. In a single day, this administration managed to convince Tehran that America cannot be trusted to keep its word, convince its own allies that America cannot be trusted to keep its word, and convince its own chief negotiator that America cannot be trusted to keep its word. 3 audiences, 1 post. You do have to admire the efficiency. I'm Marcus Fenn. This is Borderlines. Analysis from the edge. If this is the kind of analysis you want more of, subscribe, because the next 24 hours are going to produce something too, and somebody should probably be writing it down. The most expensive sentences, as it turns out, are usually the short ones.